Hey Heather, would you like to have a coffee or coffee alternative with me today?
Yes, I would. And I would love to tell you what I'm drinking.
And what is that?
It is a mixture of cacao, decaffeinated coffee, and decaffeinated Earl Grey tea, unsweetened with no milk or milk alternative. And it is such a great flavor. My mom told me about it when she was working at this gift shop in a museum in Arizona before the pandemic. And she said they serve that. Now, of course, they put loads of sugar and milk and stuff, I'm sure, but I
Yeah,
just love the flavor. So I invite everyone to try it sometime.
you might have to leave a recipe somewhere in the show notes today because I feel like a drink like that deserves its own name and possibly an entire website dedicated to it.
I think it actually did have a name. I'll have to look up the cafe. It's at the Frank Lloyd Wright Museum
Hmm.
in Arizona, in Phoenix. And I think it did have a name, but it's been so many years.
So what is freshly brewed for you today in the metaphorical sense?
Yeah, so a few days ago I attended a live um emergency town hall, they called it on YouTube, called The Corporate Coup in Global Context, although to be fair, they never really covered the global context. It stayed pretty much in the US. But it was a conversation between Naomi Klein, Chenjerai Kumanika, Astra Taylor, and Kianga Yamata Taylor. I'm not sure how to pronounce these names, but yeah, so they were, it was a live in the moment. What are their takes on what's going on with what's happening in the US? And one of the things they brought up was how, they consider themselves to be on the left, I think. And I don't know, they were talking about the left and the right. And what stood out for me is that probably a lot of people in the US think that the Democrats are on the left. And maybe they were at some point. And the same in the UK. I'll bring in the UK, the global context with the UK, and say that the Labour Party's in power right now, and a lot of people question. A lot of people who are very on the left question, say Labour's not on the left, and it seems like how you gauge it has shifted. Like I remember people were saying that like when it comes to the genocide in Gaza, that, Biden and Harris were like to the right of Reagan, and Carter and, like all these. Bill Carter was Democrat, wasn't he? But, they're to the right of people who are Republicans. And, I think Kamala Harris said, we're going to have the most lethal military in the world. And it's just like, what? Who are you? Like, what are you talking about? Like, how is this the left? And it's not. It's not the left, I don't think. But the problem is that there are people like who vote for Trump. There are people who think the Democrats are the left. And so then they judge the left by the standards of the Democrats. And so then they say, well, we don't want the status quo anymore. And the only one promising some kind of big change is Trump. Hmm.
Yeah, I think this is an important discussion. There are certain aspects that you and I have talked about in the past, particularly in other podcast recordings that we've done, I have asked the question, what is the left exactly? Um, and so I did a little bit of reading, and here I have in front of me an article by Encyclopedia Britannica online, and it provides a little bit of history. It says, quote, the origin of the left-right political axis is generally dated to 1789, when the French National Assembly met in Versailles. And during the several days of this meeting, the legislators who upheld revolutionary values tended to group themselves on the left of the assembly, while those who supported the monarchy were grouped on the right. This helped establish a persistent association between the left and revolutionary values, which tended toward egalitarianism, and between the right and traditionalist or hierarchical values. Now, it goes on to talk about, as you and I have also discussed in our own ways, the challenges of looking at politics through the left-right axis. And you've just surfaced one of those challenges, which I would say is particularly specific to the United States and the United Kingdom. Even in this article, it says the following, quote, many people have attempted to establish more complex descriptions of the political spectrum. And it goes on to talk about other hierarchies like this two-dimensional radicalism, conservatism, and nationalism, internationalism axis, et cetera, et cetera. But the article also acknowledges that, at least here in the so-called West, there's still a gravitation toward this left-right type of description. And the issue I have is, if somebody were to tell me they were on the left, I wouldn't exactly be certain of what they're talking about. I would want to go into specific issues, which you did just now by talking about Gaza, and the position of the Biden-Harris administration being in certain ways to the right of Reagan. Now, we would have to talk a little bit about what that means. And I would say in that particular case, being to the right means being more domineering, more, I'm not even sure how to describe it. I was about to say more lethal, but that's not quite what I mean. And I think one of the moments that you're referring to in the context of Reagan is, and I don't have a reference in front of me, so I apologize to the listeners, the time when Reagan picked up the phone with Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Menachem Begin, and said that Israel is implementing a, quote, Holocaust in Lebanon. This was in the early 80s. And basically, Reagan was trying to, sorry, let me pause and say, part of the reason why people over the last year have raised that as an example was to bring the message that, listen, this administration, the Biden administration, could have stopped the bombing with one phone call. Then, to highlight that, they use Reagan's phone call to Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin as an example of that. And I'm speaking off the cuff, so I'm hoping I'm getting all the names and facts right. But to use that example to illustrate the political spectrum of left and right, I think it's important to bring in this type of, it is important to bring in these types of examples to start to illustrate the points that we're making when we use these words, left and right. So when I think of the left, and I'm talking specifically about my perspective, certainly having been exposed to the thoughts that you have had and other people have had that I've interacted with over the last year on questions of colonialism, questions of internationalism, or maybe I should just say looking beyond the US perspective. I've come to see the so-called left, if we're going to use that term, as essentially being anti-capitalist, or to put it in a more important sense, egalitarianism, taking care of all people. To quote again the Britannica article where it says the left tended toward egalitarianism, there's an implicit assumption underneath that, which is that egalitarianism and capitalism cannot coexist. So for me, a leftist who is a capitalist is not exactly a leftist, right? You've in the past critiqued liberals, to use that word, liberals, and distinguished between liberals and people on the left. And so that's a whole other layer of discussion that we could have. But I think in the moment, particularly these particular times in the United States of America, I like what you're talking about in terms of offering a real alternative. I've heard some people describe Trump as a revolutionary conservative. And so when we talk about why people voted for Trump, and we've had this discussion a little bit in the past, there are many, many, many layers, and everybody's offered an opinion. They react to the wokeness? Oh, was the economy? Oh, they hated identity politics, et cetera, et cetera. There's this notion, I feel like, um, in certain segments that people did want to blow up the system. Um, because whatever was going on was not working for them. Some folks have said, well, if the Democrats had offered Bernie Sanders instead of Kamala, maybe things would have gone different. There's a million and one analyses that we could use to take this conversation one way or another. And I feel like myself, I'm rather rambling in circles and going off in all sorts of different directions. So I think what I want to do is just pause and amplify what you're saying about the status quo and how folks are responding to it. And I think I just want to pause there and see what comes up for you based on what I've said, based on
Yeah,
my
it was so
ramblings.
interesting to hear the definition Encyclopedia Britannica because yeah, I mean the Democrats aren't revolutionary.
Mhm.
um and of course it's what they mean at the time, like
Sure.
it's, I guess. Um yeah, I think that there's, like you say, there's a lot of things that people are saying about why people allowed Trump to win, even if they didn't vote for him. There's people that sat out. Um, yeah, and it can be because, well, I mean, in that town hall meeting that I attended online a couple of days ago, they talked about how the tech bros and the Christian evangelicals, the Christian Zionists, all these people are kind of accelerationists. They're nihilistic. Like they want things to explode. They want to, but they have different reasons for it. But they've joined together in solidarity with their class of billionaires and very wealthy people. They've joined together to make it happen, even though the way they see it play out in their own favor, isn't compatible with each other's. But that's really dangerous, to have that going on. And the opposition, I guess we would call it, if you want, you don't have to call it the left, you don't have to call it, but the opposition to that isn't messaging this. The messages we got from the Democrats were some flippant fascism, But then they were super cordial about transferring power to fascists, apparently. Like, joke around, Obama sitting there joking with Trump at the inauguration. And you're just like, oh, I mean, at least Michelle Obama didn't go. But, you just like, what? And like, so there's something, I mean, people look at that and they're like, how are we supposed to take these people seriously? They said they were fascists. And yet they're willing to sit quietly, supposedly with like a Hitler type person, It's just, it's so disingenuous. And it really means that there's a lack of trust, in the political system.
Mhm.
And there's no one messaging like, well, the Democrats are the main opposition, and they're not messaging anything, they're, it, it's so horrible, which is why I don't identify with the spectrum at all. Because, and this is based on a book that I've talked about before, Up From Under the Rulers by H. Peter Steves. And he talks about how the whole spectrum is a form of liberalism. And I don't mean liberals, but
Mhm.
liberalism. And so it's about people acting in isolated ways, in selfish ways, like in terms of a social contract. And, everyone's, so the left is more like the state should be providing
Mhm.
health care and, like the state should do more, should care more about people and do more for people. And then the right is like more libertarian, like we should let people do what they want and not interfere. Of course, even people that say that they want those things don't follow through because of like the heavy subsidies that we see from the right into technology and bailing out, and it's like
Yeah, the
socialism
military.
for rich people and
Yeah.
all of that.
Hmm.
um so for me it's quite in a well, Steve's in this book says that it's quite an illusion of choices, to say, oh, we get to choose between this really narrow spectrum. It's not it's not a real choice. I mean, most people know that because that's why they don't vote. They know there's no real choice between them and that the system's rigged and it's for the wealthy. And he says, and I agree, and lots of people have said that in some ways the Democrats are worse because they put the pride flag on the military
Hmm.
equipment, So they like try to come across as woke or better, but they're still doing so many of the same things.
Hmm.
Genocide being one of them. And even Trump supposedly coming across and, you know, and got a ceasefire, you know, okay. But that's all like, it's all so murky and yucky and their motives. And he wants to put Trump hotels in the beaches of Gaza. It's like, what, so dystopian. What's going on? Like, did you want that or did you want the Biden genocide? It's like there's no choice here. So for me, like stepping away from the spectrum, it's about saying, no, we're not going to give up what it means to be human and in relationship with each other to these big institutions, to people who make decisions on our behalf. It's not a democracy to be like voting for one person that's going to have the power that Trump or Biden has, because they're not representing us. if we didn't vote for them. And then even if you did vote for them, you're not actually saying what's the list of things I agree with everything on that list that you're going to do. That's just not democracy, you know? Like we're not getting our voices heard. And so to me, that's why I'm a communitarian anarchist, because I want us to flourish as humans. And that means that we participate fully in everything that affects us. And it's impossible to do that at such, with capitalism. It's impossible to do it with states dominating and deciding and the borders that are violent. Like we need to be free to go out wherever we want in the world and build community and build relationships. And we're not allowed to do that. And I think that that's why I'm not on the spectrum of left and right.
I think, and I've been avoiding this topic, but I think, obviously, given the moment, um, and given what's been happening in this country since, let's say, January 20th, I think there are some definite overlaps between, and I will say specifically political parties, Democrats and Republicans here in the United States. And you've talked about already the military industrial complex as something I think there's a strong overlap with. But I will also say, having observed what's been going on, and also having read and listened to people who warned us about this and who have been warning us about this for many years, I will say, I'm not speaking from facts here, I'm speaking from my belief. I will say, if a Biden Harris administration had been reelected, I don't think there would have been what we're seeing now, which is revolutionary destruction of federal agencies, grant funding to nonprofits, state grants as well, um, under the illusion of things like efficiency and, getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. I don't think the Biden-Harris administration would have done that. So I feel many, many, many mixed feelings about what is going on because I'm wrapping back to what we said at the beginning of this conversation, this idea of the status quo and the party in power at the time from 2020 to 2024, that is the Democratic Party, being seen as a status quo party, even though we could, and again, I don't have any references in front of me, we could talk about things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the other types of acts that did really important things for people, especially during the time of COVID. I think I will continue to struggle with figuring out just how we got from there to here. And I'll have to leave that type of analysis to people who are much more intelligent than me, much more well-read than me, much more versed in theory, in history. But I feel like as I'm going from this conversation, which I don't think I was very well prepared for at all, I am going away from this conversation with this idea of what does it really mean to offer an alternative that works for more people. I think we may have talked in an earlier episode about how the votes for Trump were up plus 3 million approximately from 2020, while the Democrats were down 10 million. That's a huge difference, and it speaks to
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't like doing that when we have an electoral college, because
yeah, yeah, yeah.
people know that their state's going to vote one way. It's more interesting to look at exactly what happened in the swing states.
True, true. Yeah, and one of the things you talked about, thanks for reminding me, is that given the notion of swing states and the reality of the Electoral College, that the votes of a very small number of people, I think in the hundreds of thousands, can really swing an election one way or the other. So I'm going away from this meeting with much less clarity than I would like. Um, I think I just want to hold on to this notion of what is my way? What is my place? What is my work to do to offer people a real set of processes, set of institutions, set of relationships that works for them? I won't even call it alternative. I mean, just leaving aside the comparison between what is today and what could be, we could certainly talk about what is not working and how do we, particularly you and I in our work, offer something that works for people?
Yeah.
What are the barriers to that? And what are the special skills and opportunities and relationships that you and I have access to offer something that really works? I think there's also a big piece to talk about regarding a scale that we don't have time to go into today.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is when you talked about your description as a communitarian anarchist, I also feel that you were talking about scale in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of a state being a very large, big scale, and in a certain way amorphous, monolithic type of like removed institution, an
Yeah.
institution that's hard to relate to, hard to have relations with, hard to influence,
You
and
can't have a
yeah,
relationship with an
yeah,
institution. Yeah.
yeah, and contrasting that with what it means to meet people's needs and to be that, of course, I think really mandates being much more relational.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that means by nature, it's a much more small scale, local or hyper local type of relationship. And that could be a long discussion perhaps for another time, but it's also
Mm-hmm.
something I'm thinking about. Because I will say, just as a final point, here in the US, there are people who are going out and protesting for the first time. There are people calling their senators, going to town halls for the first time. I feel like, in a certain way, I've gone in the opposite direction. I've become much more, I don't think the word is insular, but much more focused on the small scale. I've been reaching out to people who I'm connected to, asking, how are you doing? Especially the many federal employees and contractors in my network, some of whom I haven't talked to for a couple of decades in some cases. A much more individual, one to one relating from me to the people who are closest to me. Um, I'm sure there are some folks who should say or would say that I need to be outside on the streets. And there is merit to that, that I need to be much more out there. But in a way, I'm feeling like in the last few weeks, I've been much more in here, looking at my own relationships with close people and also my own relationship to myself, working on my own thoughts and my own perspectives.
Mm.
And conversations like this are part of that. Um,
Yeah. I
yeah.
think that it sounds like you're being more strategic
Hmm.
um, for yourself. And I just want to point out that even even though I do advocate for more local, I would say that it needs to be
Hmm.
networked local. And I guess I would just say also like how you said ending this coffee break with questions. I mean, I think that's what we want, isn't it? We want people to question. We want people to engage with nuance. complexity and to be more comfortable with uncertainty.
Yeah, I think it's very much necessary at this time. And one thing I'm going away with, perhaps the main thing I'm going away with right now, given what you just said, is that the ways that we do those things, we don't have to do those things alone.
Mm,
Um, and it's really a place where to build strength, to build resilience, community is necessary more now than ever. Um, that we can do these things relationally.
mm,
Um, and in a way, I feel like that's the counter to some of this individualism. The idea that um, some people might call it strength in numbers, but I would just say it's time to remember the relationships that we have
mm.
and what that can do for us being communities.
Yeah. And Peter Gelderloos says that community is the people that you count on for survival. And I think that's on a lot of people's minds now.
Yeah.
Good
Well,
talking to you.
good talking to you as well. Thank you for this coffee, non-coffee, coffee alternative break.
Coffee, tea, hot chocolate combination.
Yeah,
We'll
Earl
put the
Grey tea.
recipe in the show notes.
Yep.
And
Thank
I'll
you, everybody, for
see you
listening.
next week.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye. You have been listening to Morning Tinto with Heather Luna and Chris Musay Sequeira. Each time we record, we use the news of the day to be as freshly brewed as possible. So subscribe, follow along, and comment if you can. Let us know what you think, and we will talk to you soon. Bye bye.